Howdy, friends. Thank you for listening to the Roundup Podcast. In this season of the podcast, you will hear breakout audio from Roundup 2024. If you have any questions related to the content, send them to sbtccollegiate@sbtexas.com. Don't forget, follow us on social media at sbtccollegiate. Now, enjoy the podcast.
My name is Allen Tate. I am the Executive Director of the Well Network in Florence, Alabama. And I am not an expert on multiplication. So what I'm about to share with you are some principles that we have learned that I think the Lord has blessed. But the story I'm going to tell you and everything that I'm going to lay out is all the Lord. It's not, there's some people in Florence, Alabama that were smart enough to make all this happen. I can promise you that was not the case, right? But we have seen some unbelievable things happen by God's grace, by His hand, by His guiding, by His leading, by His moving. And ultimately, when it comes to this breakout, talking about creating a culture of multiplication, creating a culture where multiplication can actually begin to happen and exist, we have begun to see that happen. We've begun to see God do that in our churches and in our college students. And so I know you're here because on some level you're trying to wrestle with what does that look like, or you're trying to wrestle with how do we continue to make this happen, and probably everything in the middle, right? Let me tell you a little bit about our story. 2003, there was a college ministry that was started at Highland Baptist Church in Florence, Alabama. University of North Alabama is there. It's about 8,000 students at the time. Just rose up. So the Well College ministry began in that time. 2003 to 2009 it was just part-time. College pastor was in that superhero position of youth in college and was trying to do both of those things. 2010, they hired me. Highland Baptist Church hired me as the first full-time college pastor at the Well in Florence, Alabama. In 2010 to 2015, all was great in the world, right? God was blessing our ministry. We were seeing people come to our things. We were the largest student org on campus. Like, everything was great. And then began to look around our state and recognize that 350,000 college students in Alabama, which is not a ton of college students in comparison to a state like Texas, but it's a lot, right? It's still a lot of people, a lot of souls. And at the time, in 2014-15, there were 12 full-time college pastors in Southern Baptist churches. And the majority of them were in places like Auburn and Tuscaloosa and Birmingham. And you had a bunch of campuses where the church just was not reaching and engaging the university. I mean, campuses that are not tiny. I mean, 10, 15, 20,000 students in some of these places, and the church was not actively engaging the campus. And so, as a brash, 30-year-old at the time, I'm like, these churches, God's going to judge them, right? He's going to let them know they missed the mark. And then I had one of those 2 a.m. moments. Like, you ever have the 2 a.m. moments where the Lord just wakes you up out of dead sleep with a thought, and you're like, I don't know where that came from. It had to come from the Lord. I had one of those moments. 2 a.m., wake up. He's like, what if I put that burden on your heart for you to do something about it? I'm like, no. Lord, things are good. Like, we're great. We're doing our job. They just got to do their job. And He's like, what if I'm making this your job? I'm like, no, Lord. We don't know what we're doing. Like, we don't know how to do that. Long story short, we ended up doing what the Lord said to do, right? It's always the right thing to do. I hope you're doing what the Lord says to do, because anytime I've run from that, generally doesn't end well, right? So in 2016, by we, I mean like my senior pastor, our church, launched our college ministry out. This was not a church split. We were not running, right? They launched us out as a church plant with this vision. Like, Lord, would you do something in Florence with the safety net of our mothership right here that we could replicate in other university cities in the Southeast? We had no idea how to plant a church. We didn't raise money for this church. Like, we by God's grace and God's grace alone, this church is still alive and healthy and thriving, okay? There was no strategy other than We just see what you're calling us to, and we're just going to take a step of faith and trust that you're going to lead us and equip us to do it, right? We had a grand vision of like, hey, in 2 years, we'll plant a church in Huntsville and figure that out, right? But right now, we just got to get this together. 6 months in, church in Huntsville calls us and says, hey, we hear you're trying to plant a church over here to reach the campus, reach the city. We're like half a block from the campus. We've got no college students. Will you come over here and let us partner with you to do this? And we're like, we're 6 months into what we don't already know. Like, why not throw another one into the mix? And so in 2017, we planted what is now Church on the Hill. Ethan McCreary, pastor of that church, is here as well. He'll lead some breakouts in the afternoon about shepherding. So that was 2017. We still have no idea what we're doing. We're just trying to hang on for dear life, right? Start to get our feet underneath us and like, okay, we're ready to do this again. We brought a guy in residency named Britton Latham, who ultimately planted Church at the Oaks in Tuscaloosa in the middle of COVID. What a wonderful time. At the same time, we're like, we've got to get our stuff together. So Lord is showing us more. He's equipping us. He's making us more and more competent on what is actually needed when it comes to church planting. And with this, we established the Well Network, which is centralized support and structure for these church plants in their infancy. But it also established the residency. And with the church planting residency, we began to bring residents in alongside these plants for 18 to 24 months before we're sending them out. So really smart. We're going to equip these guys before they go now. Let's try to actually do this healthily. So our first resident that came through was Malachi Cole, who planted Banner Church in Jacksonville, Alabama, just over a year and a half ago. And then in 2024, what we've seen happen, or what we will see happen, is Church of the Heights in Starkville, Mississippi. We have crossed enemy lines into Mississippi. So he will plant in the fall of this coming year. He's in all pre-launch stage right now. And then Five Rivers Church in Mobile with Christian Caldwell just left residency about 5 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, moved to Mobile. And they will plant sometime at the end of the year or the very beginning of 2025. And what's beautiful about this plant is that this one, and this one all came out of this church. But this one came out of this church. And so we're getting to a place where we're starting to see our babies have babies. And I can't wait to the day when our babies have babies. Like, that's what we're hoping for. So this is what God has done. So how did it start? It started with these two people that had no idea what they were doing. This is what college ministry does to you, so get out now, right? 25 started in ministry, one campus, 8,000 students. That's what we were doing. Running hard after it with our two little dogs that neither of whom we have anymore because we got kids. And this is what our staff looks like today. So one family, 8,000 students, one ministry, and God's turned that into, and I mean that, God's turned that into over 40 staff engaging over 100,000 students. And He can do that where you are too. I absolutely believe He can do that where you are too. He's probably already doing some of that in some of your places. He's already got birthed that burden, that desire, that vision in your heart. And I'm telling you, He can do it. You're like, how do you know? Because I've watched Him do it, right? He's continually doing it. Here's what I want you to understand from the very beginning. When we talk about building a culture of multiplication, here's what I want you to hear from me, and you're going to hear it over and over and over again. Multiplication is the biblical mandate. I don't care what your job description says. I don't care whether you're in vocational ministry or not. No one has to give you permission to multiply because Christ has already called you to do it. Multiplication is the biblical mandate. We go all the way back to the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, we look at the creation mandate. God creates all things, then creates Adam and Eve. He looks at them and He gives them this in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. He says, be fruitful and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. Now we know in that context what He was doing. He was telling them to physically fill the earth, like to have children. But if we just back up a little bit and look at the heart of God over the scope of Scripture, we see that God's desire for fruitfulness and multiplication does not stop with our physical children, right? He wants that, in every area of our life. He wants that specifically in our spiritual life. He wants us to have spiritual children, right? It is what discipleship is ultimately created to do. We see that most clearly in the life of Jesus. What did Jesus do? He was fruitful and he multiplied. Right? That is ultimately the scope of his ministry, was fruitfulness and multiplication. Most clearly, right, at the end of his life. He's died, he's rose from the grave. At the end of his time here on earth, I should say, he calls those disciples to the mountain, and he looks them in the eye, and he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And I don't know about you, but if I was on the mountain when Jesus says that, I'm leaning in a little bit because I'm like, this sounds like it's going to be important. He says, so go. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I know it's going to feel like in just a moment I'm leaving you, but I'm not leaving you. I'm with you always to the end of the age. That's the heartbeat. And that's the mission you and I have been left with. Until he returns, that's our job. The heartbeat of God, be fruitful and multiply. Clarified in the Great Commission, go and make disciples. And then we continue moving forward in the biblical narrative to the book of Acts, and we go, okay, so how did that Great Commission on that mountaintop actually look? What did it look like in real life? We see the church begin to form, and we see this church pop up in the book of Acts called Antioch. Like God was doing something in the north of the country, and church in Jerusalem finds out about it, and they send Barnabas up there like, Barnabas, go figure this out. What's going on up there? He gets up there. Scripture says like he was blessed by the fact that he got there and experienced the grace of God in and through them. He knew that God had done in them what he had done at Pentecost. He begins to teach them and encourage them and engage with them, and then ultimately, over time, this church sends Barnabas and Paul. Starts sending them on these missionary journeys. And we begin to see what this Great Commission looks like in real life, in the life of the church, right? Like two really, really valuable things we see in the church of Antioch. One, local discipleship. And two, sending into the global mission. Like these two things are necessary if kingdom multiplication is going to be what we're about. Local discipleship and sending into the global mission. Like this is what it's all about. This is what our whole life has got to be about. Because it's what Jesus is about. And so what I want to do is I want to give you just 5 just real brief, quick principles. 4 of which ultimately don't matter if you don't do the 5th one. All right? So there's your teaser. Number 5 is the most important. All right? So you got to stick around. Don't fall asleep on me. But if you're going to create a culture of multiplication from a leadership level, it's your responsibility to first expand and clarify your vision. Like you got to do it. Multiplication will not happen if this does not happen. It's got to be there. So what if I told you that when you got back to your city, wherever that is, your job description has changed? So whatever your job description currently says or your leadership description currently says, what if I told you when you get back, your job is now to be an associational or a regional missionary? Like that's your new job. If you had to go back to where you are and think about your region or your state or the area in which you live, and that was what you were focused on reaching, how would it change your vision? If you're normal, it would probably expand your vision a little bit, right? Because we tend to get narrow vision. We tend to just try to stay in our lane. We get bogged down by the urgent things in our life and don't ultimately always get into the important things, right? Here's what I want you to hear. Regardless of what your job description says, regardless of what people expect of you, you are a regional missionary. That is your job. You say, Allen, why do you say that? Because the Great Commission's call in your life is to be a regional missionary. Amen. Right? The other side of it in Acts chapter 1 verse 8, is that you will be my witnesses, Jesus says, in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Right? So everywhere you go, this is your responsibility. As you go, Jesus says, this is your responsibility. Above all else. Your job is not to reach your campus alone. That's not your job. Like, the end goal of your ministry vision can't just be to reach your campus. That's way too small. Your job is to reach your campus so that you can reach the world. It's for a greater kingdom vision, a greater kingdom end. Your ministry, hear me, your ministry, what you're responsible for, little or big, is a means to a greater kingdom end, and you have to think that way. You have to see it that way. You have to expand your vision to that end. And if that is true, then it must absolutely impact everything that we do in ministry. And it should shape everything, including our vision that we lay before the students that are underneath our leadership. Clarifying vision requires a few things. J.D. Greer says that once you are tired of saying it, the people that you're leading are just now hearing it, right? So his point is like you got to say it and 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 say it. And at that point, when I'm getting tired of saying it, they're probably just now hearing it for the first time. You've probably been frustrated at some point. Like, you've got this huge ministry initiative. You've talked about it a ton. You've had a bunch of meetings. People have asked questions, and then like 6 months later, they're like, hey, what's this? Like, I've been telling you for 6 months, right? It's true. When you're tired of saying it, they're just now hearing it. So when it comes to expanding and clarifying your vision, like just some simple principles, you got to communicate it, you got to demonstrate it, you got to celebrate it if you want to replicate it. But I can promise you this, you will never replicate what you don't communicate. So multiplication can't happen. You're not going to see replication and multiplication happen if communication doesn't happen. Like, if you can't clarify it, if you can't say what it is that we're trying to do, then you can guarantee it will not move beyond you, right? It's too abstract. From a leadership standpoint, like, that's just baseline thing. We've got to be able to communicate in such a way that people can grasp it, be compelled by it, be moved by it, to the extent that they want to give their life for it, right? To do it. It's got to be big. It's got to be moving. And no one is going to do it for your ministry but you. You've got to do it. You have to define the when. You have to clarify what it is. And it's more than just fulfilling the Great Commission, right? Individually, we're called to fulfill the Great Commission. But more than just fulfilling the Great Commission, our church, our ministry is specifically called and cut out to fulfill the Great Commission in these ways. If we don't do this, then we stand to lose ground for the kingdom, right? We have to do this in order to gain ground in this area that God has specifically given us to take ground for the kingdom. Like, what is that? Where is that? What does it look like? Clarify it. Communicate it. Talk about it. Say it often. Why do you want to build a culture of multiplication in your church or in your ministry? Why do you want to do it? What does the kingdom stand to gain if you do? What does the kingdom stand to lose if you don't? What's the biggest vision you can think of? God's able to do it. God's able to do more than that, actually. But think about it. Clarify it. Write it down. Make it simple. Make it clear. Make it compelling. You have to know where you're going if you're going to take somebody else there. And leaders in the room, you've been put in the position you're in to not only seek the Lord and find out where He wants you to go, but also clarify it in such a way that others want to go there. So define it and say it all the time. Expand and clarify your vision. Second principle is ultimately how this vision can come to fruition. To create a culture of multiplication, you got to make discipleship the engine of your ministry. You got to make discipleship the engine of your ministry. A movement of multiplication requires individuals to multiply. It's that simple. You don't multiply at the largest levels if you don't first multiply often on the smallest levels. biblically, multiplication doesn't happen if discipleship doesn't happen, right? Like that's the biblical methodology for multiplication. Life on life, disciples making disciples. It's why Jesus left us with that Great Commission. It's what I love about Christ's plan, right? Chris was helping us understand last night just like the upside down nature of Jesus' leadership, that servant leadership, and how like antithetical really it is to like just the American dream and where we want to be. But the same thing is true just in his leadership style, right? On the other side. Like his strategy wasn't this top-down plan of crowd. Like Jesus had crowds. But think about it. Every night, what did he do with that crowd that would gather? He'd send them home. He didn't gather them and then go march on Jerusalem. No. He'd send them home. And then what would he do? Who would he be with? After some time alone, which as an introvert, I'm like, yes, Jesus, thank you for making that a pattern of your life. But after a little bit of time alone, what did he do? Pulled away with those 12. Spent his time with them again. So you should have gone to Scott Kindig's Breakout. If you didn't, you missed your chance. But he would tell you, he said it for years, he said, we're sitting in rooms like this today not because of the thousands he fed, but we're in this room today because of the 12 he led. Like this was Jesus' plan. It wasn't top down, it was bottom up. I'm starting with 12, and we're going to turn 12 into this beautiful kingdom blessing that was promised all the way back to Abraham, right? Like we're going to see the fulfillment of this, that all nations will be blessed. Why? Because we're starting with these 12. That's the beauty of it. I don't know if you've ever read Dr. Robert Coleman's book, The Master Plan of Evangelism. It's an easy read. You need to read it. But basically he says Jesus discipled in these 8 simple principles. This was his plan with these 12 guys. He discipled by selection. So he chose some to invest in deeply. He chose these 12. There were a bunch of people he didn't choose. He chose these 12. And then beyond that, we know he chose 3, right? He invested even deeper in 3. He discipled by association. He lived with them. They weren't just with him a little bit at a time. They were with him all the time. No one was around Jesus more than these 12. They were his family. It was a conscious choice on Jesus' part to spend time with them. He discipled, number 3, by consecration. He set them apart. He treated them different. He spoke to them different. Sometimes that was good, and sometimes that was bad for them, right? He was more strategic with them and asked more of them. Number 4, impartation. He gave them truth and meaning in life. And when he would teach the great crowd, what would he do? He would pull away, and then he would spend time digging deeper with them. They would ask questions. He would give them deeper truths. Number 5, demonstration. He showed them what this life was supposed to look like. And the beauty is, when he left, when he ascended back to heaven, they knew how Jesus would respond in situations because they had seen Jesus respond to those situations. He demonstrated what life in the kingdom was supposed to look like. Delegation, he asked them to do it. He trusted them with some ministry responsibilities. Sometimes it was small. Do you remember what the disciples were doing when Jesus met the woman at the well? You remember what they were doing? He had given them a responsibility. They were going to get lunch. He'd sent them into the city to find lunch. They came back out. They're like, why is he talking to this woman? Jesus, you want to eat? He's like, I got food you don't know about. And then they start looking at each other like, who brought him food? Like, that's the question they're asking. So he's delegating sometimes those responsibilities, but we also know bigger responsibilities, right? Later, he's sending them out 2 by 2 to actually do ministry. And then the partner to delegation was supervision. He helped them do it. He corrected them when they did it wrong. He corrected them when or encouraged them when they did it right. He was an incredible partner to his delegation. And then finally, reproduction. He called them to multiply. This was the expectation. Jesus' expectation on those men was that everything he had given them to give to somebody else. So hear that in your life as well. Everything Jesus has given you, he's given you to hold open-handed. Everything Jesus has given you, he's given you to give to somebody else. Like, that's what's normal in the kingdom. That's what's natural in the kingdom. So regardless of what your ministry looks like, regardless of what your leadership area looks like, I want to encourage you to change your focus. If your focus is not on discipleship as the engine, if your focus is discipleship is a piece of what we do, I'm going to encourage you to blow everything up and make it the center. Like, make it central to everything you do. Make it the engine that makes everything else run. Change what you spend the majority of your time on. Don't focus on the events, though the events are not a bad thing. Don't focus on the large group midweek service, though that's not a bad thing and can be a vital part to actually helping students come to know Jesus. Instead, focus on creating a culture and a ministry where discipleship is the win, where multiplication is the win in life-on-life discipleship. And I promise you, if you will make this the engine, everything else will grow exponentially. Your small groups are going to expand and then multiply. Your leadership team is going to expand and multiply. Your outreach opportunities are going to expand and multiply. Your salvations are going to expand and multiply. And ultimately, your sending is going to multiply. It will be slower work. It will be harder work. It will be more frustrating work. But I promise you, the fruit that comes out on the other end will outlast you. It will outlast your strategies. It will outlast your time where you are. Ethan can tell you, you can go back to that timeline and look at those first 15 years of just college ministry and combine all the salvations. And then you can look at the last 8 years of ministry and combine the salvations specifically in huddles, which are our discipleship groups. And these salvations coming from huddles alone dwarf college ministry in the large group setting where we had 200, 250 students coming every Tuesday night. Like, it's not even close, right? Like, we passed it like year 2. Of 15 years of ministry, we passed it in like 2.5, 3 years. So I promise you, it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it. So when we talk about discipleship, let's just make sure that we're on the same page, because sometimes in Christianity, we like to redefine terms a little bit. So let's just go back to the Great Commission and see what Jesus says discipleship is to be. Remember, once again, he says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all I've commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. So based on Matthew 28 alone, right? Anything we call discipleship must include the following things. 1, going to others lost and saved in the ordinary course of life. 2, engaging them with the gospel truth. 3, calling them to obedience through lordship in Christ. And 4, teaching them the ways of Jesus. So like at its core, at its baseline, anything we call discipleship has to include those 4 things, according to the Great Commission. The other thing I would tell you about discipleship, anything in your ministry right now that you're calling discipleship that doesn't produce people that make disciples is not discipleship. It may be really beneficial in a lot of other ways. It may be great leadership training. But if disciples don't make disciples as a result of it, it's not discipleship. If someone in your ministry is not making disciples, scripturally speaking, they're not a disciple, okay? It's an oxymoron. Disciples make disciples. That is what's normal and natural in the kingdom. It is not normal for disciples not to make disciples in the kingdom, right? This is what Christ has called us to. Discipleship implies multiplication. Like, it's implied in the actual term. The Great Commission explicitly implies multiplication. Jesus' plan A for kingdom expansion is not larger worship services, though there is a significant, vital purpose for them. God's plan A for kingdom multiplication is not, or kingdom expansion is not your small group strategy, though they have a vital place for community and biblical encouragement. God's plan A for kingdom multiplication, kingdom expansion is not that golden calf in your ministry that you know you can't touch because like people would be upset with you if it went away. That's not His plan. God's plan A for kingdom multiplication, kingdom expansion is really simple. Regular, everyday disciples of Jesus taking seriously the call to multiply themselves by being disciple makers. That's God's plan A. It has been from the beginning. And it has to be the primary focus of your ministry if your ministry is going to line up with God's heart for the kingdom. Nothing else happens if this doesn't happen. As a matter of fact, there is no culture of multiplication if this doesn't happen. We shifted everything in our ministry, college ministry, around these principles, specifically this principle, about 8 years ago. And once again, this is Ethan McCreary. He's the pastor of the second church in our network in Huntsville. He will tell you that there are not 1,000 programs in our church because we don't have the time or the energy and the resources to make 1,000 programs happen. But at the same time, we were convicted that this needs to be the central program of our church, like everything else comes off of this thing. And everything that I showed you in that timeline earlier, everything that I showed you with that picture earlier, is all because of that. It's all the multiplicative work of God through us just making this the priority. Let me just tell you, some of the greatest joys I have in ministry today are when I get to step over into Huntsville and I get to walk into the office of a guy named Justin Barnett, who was a student in 2010 in the college ministry. And I had the opportunity to walk with him, encourage him as a student, disciple him in some ways as a student, and then he moves to Huntsville. He's on staff with our church in Huntsville. And then I get to meet people that he's discipled that have no idea who I am. And I begin to recognize that the greatest joy in ministry is not the large crowd. The greatest joy in ministry is that the fact that I get the opportunity through a guy like Justin to disciple in rooms I never step in. Like God's doing a work from the ripple of just my obedience in one other guy's life that I'll never see the end of, right? That's the win. That's the win. And that's happening across our network, and absolutely, if you make this central, if you make this the big deal, if you make this everything, can happen where you are as well, because this is ultimately what Christ has called us to. The great joy of discipleship is discipling in rooms that we'll never step in. So discipleship has to be the engine for your ministry. Number 3, in order to create a culture of multiplication, you got to model the culture you desire to create. And so just going back to the last point, if you aren't making disciples, then your ministry won't either. Your church won't either. You can't just say it and expect it to happen. You've got to model the culture you want to create. So if you don't walk the talk, it won't happen. If you've been where you are in a staff position specifically for any period of time, the culture of your ministry is ultimately of your own making, right? It's based on what you have been modeling. Right, wrong, indifferent, the good, the bad, the ugly, like you have helped model that culture that has led to ultimately what your ministry or your church actually is at this point. I say that not to just paint a broad brush and say, other extenuating circumstances don't affect it. They absolutely do. But I say that to you for you to understand just how significant your role is in not just saying the right things or presenting this beautiful vision, but also actually doing it. Like actually leading out and doing it. Somebody's got to go first. Somebody's got to go chart the path. Somebody's got to go through the wall, right? Somebody's got to do it. We said it earlier. Communication's really important. The second piece is demonstration, and you've got to be the first and the regular demonstrator of all of these things. Like you got to do it. No one knows what it looks like. Can you imagine if Jesus called those men to come and follow him and then never showed them what ministry was to look like? They'd be a mess. They were already a mess, and he did show them, right? So you've got to show it. Your role as a minister of the gospel is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, and you have no more powerful tool in your arsenal than the tool of demonstration. You've got to be the first one in. You've got to constantly be banging the drum and setting the course, the one who's willing to lead out. Somebody's got to go through the wall. Somebody's got to chart the course. Somebody's got to go first, and you are in your position to do just that. You can look around all you want. God's put you where He's put you to go first. Sadly, there are many people in our pews who have no idea that they've got a call in their life. They've sat in church their whole life and have no idea that the Lord actually wants to include them in His mission. Or they know the Great Commission, but they have no idea of how to actually make it actionable and apply it. So you need early adopters. And good news, college students are the ultimate early adopters in everything in life, right? And so you've got them already. So put discipleship at the center of your life, not just at the center of your ministry. Put discipleship at the center of your life. Personally multiply yourself. Give it the lion's share of your time and your energy, your best time and your best energy and your best attention. Show them and teach them. But I would remind you, you will never create a multiplying culture if you're not multiplying. It just won't happen. It absolutely won't happen. Number 4, so culture must be modeled to be made. Number 4, understand the necessity of sending. We're almost there. Hang in there. Lunch is coming, okay? Because you do college ministry, you already have an unbelievably powerful sending mechanism already in place. I don't know if your cities are like my city, but my city, college students graduate and they move somewhere else. And for a long time, I lamented that fact. And then the Lord, once again, woke me up at 2 a.m. He's like, hey, I'm already sending them. Would you just recognize that you're not losing them? You could actually launch them. There's a difference. You got to change your mentality here. They're going. So why don't you get on board and actually send them somewhere? My question is, do you see it that way? Because you do college ministry, you already have the most powerful sending mechanism already in place. Do you see it that way? Are you seeing it as launching them into the mission of God? Or are you seeing them as just losing them to another city, another church, another place? What are you graduating? For those of you that are in vocational ministry in the room, what are you graduating? What do they look like when they graduate? Are you just graduating seniors? Is that what we're celebrating? These are our seniors. We're going to celebrate them. We're going to graduate them and send them out. Or are you graduating missionaries? Are you graduating ministers? Are you graduating pastors? Are you graduating disciple makers? Here's what I want you to hear. It's the university's job to graduate seniors. That's not your job. As a matter of fact, the university is going to graduate seniors with or without you. I heard recently, and if I knew who said it, I would give you their name. But graduation is the Great Commission without the gospel. Right? They're being sent from that school without the gospel, with or without you. Right? It's your job to saturate them in the gospel. That's why you're there. It's their job to graduate seniors. It's your job to graduate disciple makers. It's your job to graduate missionaries. It's your job to graduate people that understand God's burden for the lost and actually want to go do something about that. You have 3 to 4 years to teach them everything Jesus has commanded of them. That's a massive task. So you have to shift your focus. You've got to shift your focus. Where are you sending them? Where are the mission fields beyond your ministry? Where are you challenging them to go? You have to understand the necessity of sending. If you begin multiplying down here on the individual level and that starts to move into your small groups and that starts to affect how many people are showing up to your large group gathering, you can't just put a bottle cap on it right there. Because eventually all these people are going to go find somewhere with a bigger and more compelling vision, because they go, the kingdom is bigger than this place, and I want to be about the kingdom, right? And so you begin to realize that the funnel opens up the other way, and you've got to clarify where they're going. You don't have to plant churches, right? That may not be a part of your vision, but absolutely you got to leverage every opportunity you've got to put these folks on the field somewhere outside of where you are. Because God's calling some of them to go. And God's calling some of them to go to places that are strategic. Really, really, really strategic and difficult for the kingdom. And God's called and cut them out to go there. So how many missionaries do you want to put on the field in the next 5 years? Like, name that number. Like, put a number on it. And start talking about it. Start communicating it. And don't make it like 2. Like, make it a number that God's got to do it. God, you've got to do this. We got 100 students in our ministry. We want to send 25. We want to send 25% on mission in the next calendar year. What does that look like? 50. We want to put 50 international missionaries on the ground in long-term capacity over the course of the next 5 years. Lord, you've got to do this, but we know this. Your heart agrees with this. This is in line with the kingdom. Would you do this in and through us, right? How many ministers you want to put on the ground? How many church plant team members you want to put on the ground somewhere with a church plant, leveraging their career in a place that's strategic for the gospel? Like, you've got to make sending a natural part of who you are and what you do. Everybody else in their life is telling them what they should do post-grad. Everybody. Don't you think God's got something He wants to say? And don't you think He's put you in a position of leadership in their life to help them see what God has to say about this? And don't you think you should probably start leveraging your responsibility to help them understand that the mission probably should be considered before the marketplace? That they could get that nursing job anywhere? They should probably look for strategic, missional, kingdom-focused places first and then get their nursing job there for the sake of the kingdom, right? Like, you've got to start thinking differently. You've got to shift your focus. You've got to clarify and communicate. And then, when that sweet young lady in your college ministry answers the call and she goes, you're right, I can get this. I can get an education. I can get an education job anywhere, and so I'm going to move to Boston, where church planting is really difficult, and it's happening, and God's gripped my heart for that, and I'm going to go up there. I'm going to get a teaching job there, and I'm going to serve alongside a church plant because you've taught me how to make disciples, and they need people like me to just be faithful church members just doing the work in the city. You know what you do? Put her beside you on stage, and you celebrate the heck out of it. You make the biggest deal, because what she's doing is the normal thing in the kingdom. To do anything else is abnormal in the kingdom. To just go live a quiet life and come to church a couple of times a year and maybe give and serve every once in a while, that's not normal in the kingdom. Saying yes, this is normal, right? And sometimes saying yes means staying. That's also normal. But you've got to be calling them to go. You've got to be calling and willing to send and clarifying ultimately what sending looks like. All right, now I need you to take a deep breath and prepare for what I'm about to say, because sending is easy when you're sending people that are burrs in your side, you know. But you also have to be prepared to send your best. Like, your best. Your absolute best. And whoever's in your mind right now, that's probably who I'm talking about, right? Like, that's who you have to be prepared to send. I told you about Five Rivers Church, Mobile, that'll launch this next year. What I didn't tell you is that Christian was Ethan's worship pastor in 2017 when they launched in Huntsville. Right-hand man, right? Along for the ride, helping make every decision since 2017. You just sent him. You think that don't hurt? You think he's not back there lamenting the fact that one of his best friends in the world, best friends in ministry, is no longer going to be in an office next to his, helping him make decisions? Absolutely, it hurts. But it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it. And you've got to be willing to send your absolute best. You got to send them. So fight the temptation in your heart to keep them. Fight the temptation in your heart to hoard them. Send them. Multiplication requires it for the kingdom, not our castles. Right? Send them. It's the only way, but even more, it's Jesus' way. Right? That's what he did. He sent them. He didn't hoard them all up together. They went all over the place because he sent them. All right, I promise you, number 5. We're almost done. What time is this in? Right now? All right, here we go. Most important, pray. To create a culture of multiplication, you got to pray. We've talked a lot about our work, our job, as ministers of the gospel is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. That is really practical in a lot of ways. But at the end of the day, the actual work of multiplication belongs to Jesus. It's his work. He's the multiplier. It's the work of the Spirit of God to grip us with a vision and a burden larger than ourselves. It's the work of the Spirit of God to draw people to himself. It's the work of the Spirit of God to then send those people out to their neighbors and to their nations. So 2 things. I want to encourage you to focus first on your own heart and mind. Would you just pray a prayer like this, that, Lord, would you give me a heart and a burden greater than my current context? Help me to see the larger mission. Help me to see the opportunities that are already before me to steward your resources for kingdom advancement and kingdom expansion. Here's what I want you to understand. What I've learned in ministry is that productivity follows proximity. It does not outpace it. I will never be more productive than I am close to the Lord. Like the closer I am to the Lord, the more productive I am in ministry. But it never goes the other way, right? Movements. We all want to see movement happen. We want to see culture multiplication happen. We want to see multiplication movements happen. But movements start with move me. So would you just pray that, Lord, would you move me? Would you change me? The second, when it comes to your leadership with others, would you lead your leaders to pray? And pray big, bold prayers like this. Expect them to pray. Inspect their prayer life. Support them in prayer. And then when you find those like gems of people that are just prayer warriors, that are just like all about it, that get it, that ultimately hold together everything in life and ministry, celebrate them. Like put them around your leaders and help them help your leaders become that level of a prayer warrior, right? Actually getting on their knees and fighting for the things that matter most. And then finally, I'll just leave you with this. You're not going to multiply further than you have the faith to pray. It just won't happen. James says, you have not because you ask not. It's talking about kingdom things. And Ephesians chapter 4 says this, and I love Ephesians chapter 4. He tells us to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which we've been called. But then beyond that, Paul goes on to say, hey, by the way, you're not that smart. Like anything you can ask or imagine, like literally anything you can imagine, God's capable of doing more. So your dreams, your visions can never be too big. So like ask for big things. Ask for big things and just see what the Lord is capable of doing. Like in faith, ask, Lord, would you move me and move our people to do some really significant things for the kingdom? Not for our name, not for our glory, but for yours alone, right? That's what I pray happens for you. I pray that the story I told you is just like a glimmer in comparison to what the Lord does in and through your life and through your ministry. And I pray that you take seriously His call on your life and the position He's put you in to ultimately, at the very least, leverage it for the sake of multiplication, because He's called you to it. And once again, you don't have to ask permission to do it. So He's called you to do it. So thank you for your time. I have my email here. If I can give you any of these resources or help you in any other way or answer any other questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to do it. Just really appreciate the fact you guys chose to be in here. So I'll stick around a few minutes. If you got questions, I'm happy to answer them, but you guys are free to go. So thanks for your time.